Few people notice this detail. In the swirling, chaotic theater of human interaction, amidst the clinking glasses of high society galas, the tense silence of corporate boardrooms, and the nervous energy of casual encounters, a silent hierarchy is established before a single syllable is ever uttered. The vast majority of humanity wanders through these spaces like ghosts, invisible and unremarkable, wondering why their words fall flat, why their presence is forgotten the moment they leave the room, and why the doors of opportunity remain firmly bolted shut. They mistakenly believe that charm is a mysterious, divine gift bestowed upon a lucky few, or that capturing the absolute devotion of a stranger requires a silver tongue and a rehearsed script of clever anecdotes. Yet, observing the rare individual who possesses true, magnetic charisma reveals a completely different reality. This master of connection does not rely on loud declarations or aggressive posturing. Instead, they wield a devastatingly precise arsenal of micro-behaviors, invisible psychological triggers that bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the deepest, most primal emotional centers of those around them. The transformation from a forgotten face in the crowd to an unforgettable force of nature begins in the crucial, silent seconds of the very first encounter. Picture a crowded, suffocatingly loud networking event. The ordinary person walks through the heavy oak doors, their eyes darting nervously, their posture stiff, immediately pasting a quick, universally distributed smile onto their face. They flash this identical, rapid-fire grin at everyone they lock eyes with, hoping to project friendliness. But to the recipient, this instant smile registers as cheap, insincere, and fundamentally meaningless. It is the smile of a salesperson, a politician, a desperate seeker of approval. Now, observe the entrance of the master communicator. They step into the room and stop. When their gaze meets that of a stranger, they do not smile immediately. Instead, they allow their eyes to lock onto the other person's face for one long, deliberate, agonizingly potent second. They absorb the person's features, letting a moment of profound recognition settle between them. Only then do they allow a warm, expansive smile to slowly flood their face, starting from the corners of their mouth and crinkling the edges of their eyes. This is the flooding smile. To the recipient, this deliberate, delayed reaction is psychologically intoxicating. It does not feel like a reflex, it feels like a deeply personal reward. The recipient's subconscious immediately registers that this smile was manufactured exclusively for them, born out of genuine delight at their specific presence. The heavy, defensive walls of social anxiety and suspicion instantly crumble, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable surge of warmth and receptivity toward the stranger who just made them feel entirely unique. The analysis of this silent phenomenon reveals the profound fragility of the human ego. We are creatures desperate for individual validation in a world that constantly treats us as generic background characters. The rapid, instinctive smile treats the recipient as a commodity, a mere object in the environment. The delayed smile, however, communicates thoughtful appraisal and subsequent approval. It teaches us that authenticity in communication is not merely about what we feel, but how we sequence our physical reactions. The pacing of our expressions carries as much emotional weight as the expressions themselves. By holding back the universal sign of warmth for just a fraction of a second, the master communicator transforms a mundane social reflex into a powerful, targeted weapon of validation, securing the recipient's loyalty before a single word of greeting has breached the space between them. Once the initial connection is forged, the physical dynamics of the interaction must intensify. The ordinary conversationalist treats eye contact as a fleeting courtesy, glancing away nervously to check their phone, scan the room for more important people, or simply relieve the intimate tension of the gaze. They pivot their shoulders only slightly, keeping their body angled toward the exit, projecting a subconscious desire to escape. The master communicator, however, employs a technique that binds the other person to them with invisible, unbreakable chains. They utilize sticky eyes. As the conversation flows, their gaze remains fastened to the speaker, even when a silence stretches, or when the speaker stumbles over their words. The master does not look away. If they absolutely must avert their gaze, they do so with agonizing slowness, stretching the visual tether until it reluctantly breaks, signaling that tearing their attention away is a physical struggle. When a third party interrupts or speaks, the master does not immediately snap their head toward the new voice. They keep their eyes firmly epoxied to their original target, letting the speaker know that they are the absolute center of the universe in that moment. To complement this intense visual focus, the master executes the big baby pivot. When introduced to someone new, they do not merely turn their head. They pivot their entire body, shoulders, torso, and feet, to squarely face the new arrival, giving them the same total, undivided, and enthusiastic physical attention one might give to an adorable infant suddenly brought into the room. The underlying lesson embedded in these intense physical maneuvers is that attention is the most valuable currency in human interaction, and most people are incredibly stingy with it. In a modern era plagued by chronic distraction and superficial engagements, granting someone your total, undivided physical presence is an act of profound psychological generosity. Sticky eyes and the big baby pivot capitalize on the primal human need to feel deeply significant. When an individual feels that they have completely captured the physical orientation and visual focus of a charismatic person, their self-esteem skyrockets. They associate this sudden rush of confidence and euphoria directly with the master communicator. The technique proves that you do not need to be the most fascinating person in the room to be completely unforgettable. You merely need to possess the discipline to make the person you are speaking to feel like the most fascinating person in the world. The illusion of deep connection is entirely sustained by the geometry of the body and the unwavering commitment of the gaze. Yet, even with perfect eye contact and bodily orientation, a master's presence can be instantly shattered by the microscopic betrayals of the nervous system. The ordinary person, plagued by the invisible pressures of social evaluation, constantly leaks their internal anxiety through a symphony of nervous tics. They touch their face, scratch their neck, adjust their collar, shift their weight from foot to foot, and constantly flutter their hands. To the primal, watchful regions of the observer's brain, these fidgeting movements are glaring, crimson warning signs. Evolution has taught humanity to associate erratic, unnecessary physical movement with deception, instability, and unreliability. The observer's subconscious instantly concludes that the fidgeter is either lying, hiding something, or fundamentally insecure, and the invisible shield of distrust is immediately raised. The master communicator operates with a terrifying, statuesque stillness. They understand that every physical movement must be deliberate and purposeful. They keep their hands away from their face entirely. They plant their feet firmly on the ground. When they listen, they do not nod frantically like a desperate bobblehead. They offer slow, measured, and deeply considered affirmations. This absolute physical tranquility projects an aura of unshakable authority and deep, resonant comfort. They approach every single stranger with the psychological framing of an old, dear friend. By vividly imagining that the person standing across from them is a long-lost companion they are overjoyed to see, the master's body automatically relaxes. The subconscious micro-expressions of tension are replaced by genuine, soft markers of affection. The eyebrows lift slightly, the facial muscles loosen, and the entire aura of the individual softens into a welcoming embrace. The psychological revelation here is that the human body cannot effectively lie about its internal state without immense, conscious discipline, but the internal state can be manipulated by the imagination to produce the correct physical signals. The technique of envisioning a stranger as an old friend is a form of emotional alchemy. It bypasses the conscious mind's natural defenses against the unknown. When the master visualizes this deep bond, their nervous system stops producing the stress hormones associated with encountering a stranger and begins producing the comforting chemistry of familiarity. The recipient, possessing highly attuned, instinctual eye detectors, reads this relaxed, authentic body language and unconsciously mirrors it. Their own anxiety dissipates, replaced by a strange, comforting feeling that they have known this person for years, even though they have just met. The lesson is clear: credibility and trust are not established through presenting a resume of accomplishments, but through the absolute, unyielding control of one's physical presentation. Stillness commands respect, while the projected warmth of an old friend instantly melts the icy barriers of social formality, creating a fertile, unresisting ground for whatever conversation is about to unfold. With the physical foundation perfectly, flawlessly laid, the silence must eventually be broken. The invisible tether has been cast, the defensive walls have been lowered, and the recipient stands vulnerable, waiting for the first words to validate the intense physical connection that has just been established. The master communicator knows that the opening line is not about conveying information, it is about setting the emotional trajectory of the entire relationship. They stand on the precipice of speech, ready to transition from silent magnetism to verbal captivation, armed with an entirely different set of psychological tools designed to make the recipient feel like they are the only two people existing on the planet. The silence stretches, taut and vibrating with unexpressed potential, as the master communicator prepares to cross the final, terrifying threshold from physical presence to verbal engagement. For the ordinary, untrained individual, this precise moment is a suffocating crucible of anxiety, prompting them to blurt out the most tragic, aggressively mundane opening lines imaginable. The amateur, terrified of the gaping void of silence, launches completely tone-deaf inquiries about the weather or violently intrusive questions about the recipient's professional status. They fail to realize that the opening line is not a desperate attempt to fill the air with noise, but a highly sensitive, deeply calibrated instrument designed to perfectly match the emotional temperature of the listener. The master communicator, operating with the cold, detached precision of an emotional sniper, executes a technique of absolute psychological mirroring before a single word escapes their lips. They do not forcefully impose their own energetic state onto the fragile, newly formed connection. If the recipient is exhibiting a quiet, contemplative melancholy, the master smoothly decelerates their own speech, lowering their vocal register and adopting a soothing, deeply empathetic cadence. If the recipient is vibrating with frantic, joyful excitement, the master instantly, flawlessly matches that high-frequency energy, their voice rising in pitch and their words accelerating to meet the rushing tide of the speaker's enthusiasm. This profound, immediate synchronization of emotional frequency completely short-circuits the listener's defensive neurological pathways. The subconscious mind of the recipient, constantly scanning the environment for threats and dissonance, instantly registers this perfectly matched energy not as the presence of a stranger, but as the deeply comforting, entirely safe reflection of their own internal state. The profound lesson extracted from this invisible synchronization is that human beings are fundamentally, desperately narcissistic in their emotional needs. We are irresistibly, magnetically drawn to those who seamlessly reflect our own emotional reality back to us, validating our current state of being without judgment or forceful interruption. By flawlessly matching the mood of the recipient, the master communicator completely bypasses the awkward, agonizing friction of the introductory phase, instantly establishing a foundation of deep, resonant rapport that feels less like a new acquaintance and far more like the joyful reunion of two deeply connected souls perfectly attuned to the exact same invisible frequency. Once the emotional baseline is perfectly, immaculately established, the master communicator must navigate the incredibly treacherous, universally dreaded landscape of standard conversational pleasantries. The absolute most toxic, soul-crushing trap in the entire vast arena of human interaction is the ubiquitous, lazy, and profoundly insulting question, "What do you do?" The amateur deploys this question as a desperate, uninspired crutch, entirely failing to realize that they are aggressively reducing a complex, multidimensional human being to the cold, sterile dimensions of their economic output. When an individual is asked this terrible question, their mind instantly, heavily retreats to the mundane, often deeply stressful reality of their daily labor. They are forced to quickly summarize their entire existence through the narrow, uninspiring lens of their paycheck, instantly killing any potential for vibrant, passionate, and deeply engaging dialogue. The master communicator, possessing a profound reverence for the expansive complexity of the human spirit, completely, ruthlessly eradicates this toxic question from their entire vocabulary. They understand that to forge a truly magnetic connection, one must entirely bypass the rigid, suffocating boundaries of the professional resume and strike directly at the beating, passionate heart of the individual's deepest desires. Instead of asking for a job title, the master gently, brilliantly inquires, "How do you spend most of your time? Or what occupies most of your energy these days?" The psychological impact of this subtle, masterful linguistic shift is incredibly explosive. By deliberately removing the rigid confines of professional obligation from the question, the master explicitly grants the recipient the glorious, incredibly rare permission to speak passionately about whatever currently ignites their soul. The recipient might answer by discussing a beloved, secret hobby, a profound, consuming creative project, or a deeply cherished family commitment. Suddenly, the sterile, polite conversation violently transforms into a vibrant, deeply animated exploration of human passion. The speaker's eyes light up. Their body language becomes incredibly dynamic, and they associate this sudden, rushing tide of joyful enthusiasm entirely with the master communicator who so brilliantly, generously unlocked the cage of their mundane professional identity. This deep, analytical understanding of conversational framing also dictates the master's behavior when they themselves are subjected to the terrible, mundane inquiries of others. When the amateur is asked about their own profession or their place of origin, they commit the fatal, conversation-killing sin of the naked city or the naked job. They offer a blunt, one-word answer, "I am an accountant," or "I am from Chicago," and then brutally, silently drop the conversational ball, forcing the other person to desperately, awkwardly scramble for a follow-up question. This lazy, defensive communication style places a massive, exhausting cognitive burden entirely on the listener, rapidly draining the interaction of all joyful momentum. The master communicator, however, never, under any circumstances, delivers a naked, unadorned fact. They intimately understand that every single question directed at them is a precious, highly valuable opportunity to cast a brilliant, highly compelling conversational hook into the water. If asked where they are from, they do not simply state the geographical name of the city, they beautifully, strategically embellish the fact with a fascinating, highly engaging anecdote or a bizarre, intriguing historical detail about their hometown. If asked about their profession, they do not offer a dry, corporate title, they describe the ultimate, fascinating benefit of their labor, framing their daily grind as a compelling, highly dramatic narrative of problem-solving and human triumph. By offering these richly textured, deeply intriguing answers, the master communicator generously, effortlessly provides the listener with a multitude of fascinating, highly accessible entry points into the conversation. They completely, entirely remove the painful, agonizing effort of small talk, smoothly, seamlessly guiding the interaction away from the sterile exchange of biographical data and directly into the rich, highly fertile territory of shared human curiosity and deep, mutual fascination. As the conversation inevitably flows, accelerating into deeper, more complex intellectual and emotional currents, the amateur inevitably, tragically succumbs to the paralyzing terror of not knowing exactly what to say next. They become trapped in their own mind, frantically, desperately searching their internal database for a clever anecdote or a profound, highly intelligent insight, entirely failing to actually listen to the words being spoken to them. This selfish, panic-driven internal monologue completely destroys the fragile, newly formed connection. As their eyes glaze over and their body language screams of intellectual absence, the master communicator, entirely free from the massive, crushing weight of the performing ego, utilizes an incredibly simple, almost laughably effortless, and yet profoundly devastating psychological technique known as parroting. They intimately, deeply understand that the human ego is a bottomless, starving abyss that desperately, agonizingly craves absolute, continuous validation. When the speaker naturally pauses, seeking affirmation or struggling to articulate a complex thought, the master does not aggressively jump in to hijack the narrative with their own brilliant story. Instead, they simply, Gently repeat the last 2 or 3 words the speaker just uttered, infusing their tone with a highly encouraging, deeply empathetic upward inflection of genuine curiosity. The psychological mechanics of this microscopic, seemingly insignificant verbal mirroring are incredibly, overwhelmingly powerful. By flawlessly returning the speaker's own precise words back to them, the master communicator provides absolute, undeniable proof of deep, unbroken, and fiercely focused listening. The speaker's subconscious mind instantly, joyfully registers this repetition as a massive, glowing green light of total social approval. They feel profoundly, deeply understood, and their natural, deeply ingrained defenses instantly melt away. The simple, gentle echo of their own words acts as a powerful, psychological truth serum, irresistibly compelling them to expand, to dive deeper, and to completely, beautifully unpack the hidden, emotional nuances of their previous statement. The master communicator can flawlessly, seamlessly maintain an hours-long, incredibly deep, and highly intimate conversation without ever uttering a single, original thought of their own, simply by continuously, gently parroting the speaker's final phrases. The profound, analytical lesson embedded in this masterful technique is that true, magnetic conversational brilliance has absolutely nothing to do with the exhausting, highly stressful burden of being constantly, aggressively interesting. It is entirely, exclusively about possessing the profound, disciplined empathy required to be relentlessly, genuinely interested. The individual who masters the art of the verbal echo effortlessly transforms themselves into a psychological mirror, perfectly reflecting the speaker's own brilliance back to them, thereby guaranteeing that the speaker will walk away from the interaction completely, utterly convinced that the master is the most fascinating, highly intelligent, and deeply charismatic conversationalist they have ever had the supreme, absolute privilege of encountering. Yet, to truly operate at the absolute, terrifying zenith of human connection, the master communicator cannot merely rely on active listening and brilliant deflections. They must occasionally, masterfully lead the narrative into highly exclusive, deeply intimate psychological territory. The sprawling, complex narrative of interpersonal dynamics dictates that the vast, overwhelming majority of human relationships are strictly, rigidly governed by deeply ingrained, highly restrictive social boundaries. We categorize people into safe, heavily guarded mental boxes: strangers, acquaintances, colleagues, and finally, the highly exclusive, heavily protected inner circle of deeply trusted, intimate friends. The amateur respects these rigid boundaries with complete, unquestioning obedience, engaging in safe, superficial banter for months, or even years, before desperately, awkwardly attempting to deepen the bond. The master communicator, possessing a radical, highly aggressive understanding of emotional engineering, completely, ruthlessly shatters these artificial timelines. They utilize the explosive, highly intimate power of premature we. In the normal, agonizingly slow progression of human bonding, the pronoun we is strictly, exclusively reserved for individuals who have shared significant, deeply emotional history. It is a linguistic sanctuary, denoting a unified, highly protected tribe of two. The master does not wait for history to naturally, slowly forge this linguistic bond. They aggressively, brilliantly engineer it in the very first minutes of a brand new encounter, instead of utilizing the distancing, highly formal pronouns you and I, which constantly, silently reinforce the massive, empty space separating two strangers. The master seamlessly, effortlessly weaves the words we, us, and our into the absolute fabric of their early conversation. If discussing a mundane, shared observation about the crowded, suffocating room, they do not say, "You can see how crowded it is." They lean in, their voice dropping to a conspiratorial, deeply intimate whisper, and state, "We are definitely going to have to fight our way to the front of this crowd, aren't we?" This microscopic, incredibly subtle shift in pronoun usage triggers a massive, completely disproportionate psychological response in the deep, primitive centers of the listener's brain. The subconscious mind, highly sensitive to tribal linguistic markers, instantly, completely bypasses the logical, rational knowledge that this person is a total, unknown stranger. The brain hears the unifying, deeply tribal we, and it automatically, involuntarily begins to categorize the master communicator as a safe, highly trusted, and deeply established member of the listener's own exclusive inner circle. The invisible, heavily fortified walls of social distance instantly, beautifully collapse, completely undermined by the brilliant, highly strategic deployment of a single, two-letter word. The profound, undeniable truth revealed by this masterful tactic is that emotional intimacy is not necessarily a byproduct of vast, shared time. It is a highly volatile, deeply sensitive psychological state that can be artificially, brilliantly induced through the precise, highly calculated manipulation of conversational geometry. By forcefully uniting their reality with the listener's reality through the clever, incredibly subtle use of inclusive language, the master communicator artificially, perfectly simulates the deep, comforting warmth of a lifelong friendship, instantly securing a level of absolute trust, profound vulnerability, and deep, unshakable loyalty that ordinary, terrified individuals spend their entire, frustrating lives desperately, unsuccessfully attempting to achieve. The transition from the deeply intimate, highly artificially constructed inner circle of the premature we into the incredibly dangerous, wildly unpredictable, and heavily populated outer spheres of complex social networks marks the absolute, most treacherous psychological frontier for the aspiring conversationalist. Within the swirling, chaotic, and deeply cynical vortex of the modern professional or social environment, information is the ultimate, highly weaponized currency, and the most common, incredibly toxic form of this currency is the rapid, insidious spread of negative gossip. The amateur, driven by a deeply pathetic, fundamentally insecure, and incredibly fragile ego, aggressively utilizes this toxic, highly destructive social mechanism in a desperate, deeply flawed attempt to artificially elevate their own precarious social standing. They eagerly, loudly share the embarrassing, highly private failures, the subtle, deeply humiliating missteps, and the devastating, highly confidential misfortunes of absent colleagues and supposed friends, foolishly, blindly believing that by tearing down the reputations of others, they are simultaneously, magically building a secure, highly respected pedestal for themselves. But the psychological reality of this deeply malicious behavior is entirely, violently opposed to their desperate intentions. The listener, possessing a highly attuned, deeply primitive, and incredibly sensitive subconscious threat detection system, immediately, instinctively recognizes the amateur as a deeply untrustworthy, highly dangerous, and entirely toxic presence. The listener's mind silently, terrifyingly calculates that the exact same malicious, highly aggressive tongue currently destroying the absent victim will undoubtedly, inevitably be turned against them the absolute second they turn their own vulnerable back. The master communicator, possessing a chilling, absolute, and profoundly deep mastery over the complex, invisible currents of human psychology, completely, entirely, and ruthlessly inverts this highly destructive social dynamic. They absolutely, fundamentally refuse to participate in the toxic, deeply corrosive exchange of negative information. Instead, they transform themselves into a massive, highly efficient, and incredibly powerful broadcasting station for exclusively positive, deeply flattering, and highly specific praise. They deploy the devastatingly effective, profoundly manipulative, and completely irresistible technique of the grapevine glory. The master intimately, profoundly understands that a direct, face-to-face compliment, while pleasant, is constantly, heavily filtered through the recipient's deep, ingrained suspicion of transactional flattery and hidden, highly manipulative motives. However, when a massive, highly specific, and deeply glowing compliment is strategically, carefully planted in the ears of mutual acquaintance, and then allowed to naturally, organically travel through the complex, winding, and highly unpredictable pathways of the social grapevine before finally, inevitably reaching the intended target, its psychological impact is miraculously, completely multiplied 1,000-fold. The recipient of this indirect, highly delayed praise is instantly, overwhelmingly paralyzed by the absolute, undeniable authenticity of the compliment. The deep, analytical lesson extracted from this brilliant, highly calculated social maneuver is that human beings are profoundly, desperately starving for genuine, unprompted validation, and they inherently, deeply believe that words spoken behind their backs are the only true, completely unfiltered reflection of reality. By weaponizing the entire, sprawling social network to deliver a payload of pure, unadulterated, and highly specific praise, the master communicator does not merely flatter a single ego, they successfully, beautifully construct a massive, impenetrable, and deeply loyal fortress of absolute goodwill, ensuring that their own reputation precedes them into every single room as an incredibly rare, deeply cherished, and universally beloved purveyor of positive, highly uplifting energy. Yet, when the incredibly rare, highly specific moment arrives for the master communicator to actually, physically deliver a compliment directly, squarely into the eyes of the recipient, they utterly, ruthlessly reject the lazy, deeply forgettable, and fundamentally insulting banality of generic, superficial praise. The amateur, completely lacking the necessary, deeply disciplined observational skills, tosses out empty, highly hollow, and completely meaningless comments about a generic piece of clothing, a standard physical trait, or a highly expected, deeply mundane professional accomplishment. They say, "You look nice today," or "Good job on the presentation," entirely failing to realize that these cheap, highly predictable phrases instantly evaporate into the vast, deeply forgettable void of conversational white noise, leaving absolutely zero, lasting psychological impact. The master communicator, operating with the cold, hyper-focused, and incredibly intense precision of an apex predator, executes the terrifyingly effective, deeply piercing, and profoundly unforgettable technique of the killer compliment. They do not rush to praise, they wait patiently, incredibly silently, observing the target with a deep, penetrating, and highly empathetic intensity, deliberately searching for that one specific, deeply cherished, highly unique, and incredibly vulnerable quality that the target secretly, passionately prides themselves on, but which the rest of the blind, highly distracted, and profoundly unobservant world consistently, tragically fails to notice. It might be the incredibly subtle, highly empathetic way they manage a difficult, tense conversation, or the brilliant, highly unconventional, and deeply creative logic they apply to a complex, mundane problem. When the perfect, highly vulnerable, and completely unguarded moment finally, inevitably arrives, the master communicator looks directly, intensely, and entirely unblinkingly into the recipient's eyes and delivers this highly customized, deeply personal, and incredibly specific observation with a heavy, vibrating tone of absolute, unshakable, and deeply profound conviction. The recipient is instantly, completely paralyzed, frozen by the profound, breathtaking shock of being truly, deeply, and entirely seen by another human soul. But the absolute, undeniable genius of the master does not stop there. To completely, perfectly compound this overwhelming, massive psychological victory, the master immediately, flawlessly, and incredibly smoothly pivots the entire, massive momentum of the conversation rapidly away, absolutely, fundamentally refusing to linger on the praise or to awkwardly, desperately wait for a reciprocal, obligatory return compliment. This brilliant, highly calculated, and incredibly sudden conversational withdrawal completely, entirely removes any lingering, toxic suspicion of manipulative, highly transactional flattery. The listener is left helplessly, completely intoxicated by the pure, unadulterated, and highly potent shot of profound, specific validation, entirely convinced that the master communicator possesses a deep, almost supernatural, and incredibly powerful insight into the absolute, true, and highly guarded core of their unique, beautiful human essence. As the deep, incredibly intimate relationship further develops and the massive, highly volatile conversational stakes continually rise within the unforgiving, heavily scrutinized, and intensely judgmental theater of high-stakes, highly populated social gatherings, the inevitable, horrifying, and deeply terrifying specter of the sudden human mistake violently, unexpectedly rears its incredibly ugly head. The sprawling, intense narrative violently thrusts the audience directly into a highly formal, incredibly tense, and deeply intimidating corporate dinner party, where every single word is heavily weighed and every microscopic, highly subtle physical movement is intensely, ruthlessly analyzed by a room full of powerful, deeply judgmental peers. A guest, suddenly completely consumed by a massive, highly uncontrollable surge of frantic, terrified nervous energy, commits a glaring, highly embarrassing, and completely public physical or verbal gaffe. It could be a massive, terrifyingly loud crash as a heavy glass of dark red wine shatters violently across the pristine, highly visible white tablecloth. It could be a horrific, incredibly clumsy, and deeply offensive mispronunciation of a crucial, highly respected superior's name, or it could be a sudden, violent physical stumble that instantly, completely draws the sharp, heavily judgmental, and incredibly piercing gaze of the entire, completely silenced room. The amateur, completely governed by their base, highly reactive, and deeply primitive survival instincts, gasps loudly, draws massive, highly unnecessary, and completely destructive attention to the error, or, in a desperate, deeply cruel attempt to relieve the massive, suffocating social tension, attempts to make a clumsy, highly offensive, and deeply humiliating joke directly at the terrified victim's expense. This incredibly toxic, highly aggressive behavior entirely, violently destroys the victim's deeply fragile, incredibly vulnerable public dignity. The master communicator, however, in the exact, terrifying face of this massive, highly explosive social disaster, performs an act of supreme, almost superhuman, and deeply profound psychological discipline. They instantly, flawlessly, and completely automatically deploy the incredibly powerful, highly empathetic, and deeply protective technique of the bare teeth danger. They instantly become completely, utterly, and miraculously blind, entirely deaf, and completely physically unresponsive to the massive, highly humiliating disaster. They do not flinch. Their eyes do not violently dart toward the sprawling, highly visible mess of spilled wine, and their highly controlled, perfectly relaxed facial expression remains rigidly locked in a state of absolute, serene, deeply comforting, and entirely unwavering attention. They continue the current, ongoing thread of the conversation smoothly, highly effortlessly, and completely calmly, exactly as if the catastrophic, highly embarrassing and deeply terrifying event had never, ever occurred in actual, physical reality. The profound, deeply moving, and highly analytical lesson extracted directly from this masterful, breathtaking display of profound social grace is that the incredibly fragile human ego is at its absolute most vulnerable, completely naked, and intensely terrified state in the exact, agonizing, and highly excruciating seconds immediately following a sudden, highly public mistake. By completely, deliberately, and fiercely refusing to acknowledge the highly embarrassing, incredibly obvious slip, the master communicator forcefully, beautifully throws an invisible, heavily armored, and incredibly thick psychological blanket directly over the terrified victim, silently, powerfully rescuing them from the agonizing, completely consuming flames of public humiliation. The victim's initial, terrifying, and highly explosive spike of pure, unadulterated panic is instantly, miraculously dissolved into a massive, overwhelming, and deeply permanent wave of profound, silent, and entirely eternal gratitude. They intuitively, deeply, and absolutely understand that the master communicator intentionally, highly consciously chose to completely sacrifice a moment of cheap, highly reactive, and deeply entertaining drama in order to fiercely, beautifully, and completely protect their personal, highly fragile dignity. This unspoken, highly intimate, and deeply powerful pact of absolute psychological salvation creates an incredibly strong, completely unbreakable, and fiercely burning bond of unyielding loyalty that far, entirely surpasses the weak, highly superficial connections forged through mere, ordinary, and highly mundane pleasant conversation. The ultimate, absolute, and deeply profound confirmation of this incredible, unyielding psychological dominance is flawlessly, beautifully executed not in the immediate, highly thrilling, and intensely emotional heat of the initial, deeply intense encounter, but days, weeks, or even entirely long, highly distracting months later, when the two individuals inevitably, surprisingly cross paths once again in the highly chaotic, heavily populated, and incredibly distracted landscape of modern, frantic life. The amateur, plagued by a deeply selfish, heavily distracted, and profoundly undisciplined mind, completely, utterly forgets the intricate, deeply personal, and highly vulnerable details of their previous, highly intense interactions. When they re-encounter the individual, they lazily, offensively offer a vague, completely generic, and highly forgettable greeting, forcing the entire conversational dynamic to completely, deeply frustratingly, and entirely awkwardly reset to absolute, freezing zero. This incredibly negligent, highly insulting behavior silently, powerfully signals directly to the recipient that their previous, seemingly intimate exchange was entirely meaningless, deeply insignificant, and completely, utterly forgettable to the amateur. The master communicator, however, operates their deep, incredibly vast, and highly disciplined memory like an incredibly powerful, highly organized, and deeply sensitive psychological vault. They effortlessly, brilliantly employ the devastatingly effective, deeply validating, and incredibly powerful technique of tracking. During every single, highly focused interaction, their highly attuned, incredibly present mind meticulously, perfectly records the tiny, seemingly insignificant, and highly personal micro details dropped casually, accidentally by the speaker, the specific, unusual name of a sick, elderly family pet, the upcoming, highly stressful, and deeply dreaded medical appointment, or the incredibly obscure, deeply cherished, and highly specific brand of tea they desperately, passionately prefer. When the master communicator eventually, inevitably encounters this individual again, they do not launch into a sterile, highly predictable, and completely boring greeting. Instead, they completely, brilliantly, and entirely bypass the mundane, highly superficial pleasantries and immediately, highly specifically inquire about that exact, tiny, deeply personal, and highly obscure detail. They look deeply into the recipient's eyes and ask if the golden retriever named Barnaby successfully, completely recovered from the minor, highly specific surgery, or if they finally, joyfully managed to track down that incredibly rare, highly specific Earl Grey tea. The massive, deeply emotional psychological explosion detonated by this incredibly subtle, highly calculated, and perfectly executed maneuver is absolutely, undeniably, and completely monumental. The recipient is instantly, completely overwhelmed by a massive, rushing, and deeply intoxicating tide of profound, deep, and entirely unexpected validation. The absolute, undeniable, and deeply philosophical lesson permanently embedded in this masterful, incredibly precise recall is that in a vast, cold, highly chaotic, and profoundly indifferent universe where the absolute vast majority of humanity feels entirely invisible, deeply insignificant, and completely unheard, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that an individual's seemingly minor, deeply personal, and highly specific reality has successfully, permanently, and deeply occupied a specific, highly protected, and entirely continuous space within your ongoing, active consciousness is the ultimate, absolute, and most profound compliment a human being can ever possibly receive. The master communicator deeply, intimately, and absolutely understands the true, lasting, and deeply magnetic charisma is not a bright, blinding, and highly temporary flash of intense, highly performative social energy. It is the incredibly disciplined, deeply empathetic, and highly continuous, entirely relentless accumulation of these tiny, perfectly executed, and profoundly validating psychological micro-investments. By flawlessly, perfectly tracking the intricate, highly specific, and deeply personal nuances of another human being's sprawling, complex life, the master silently, undeniably, and powerfully screams that the recipient is profoundly important, entirely unforgettable, and deeply, intensely valued. This incredibly powerful, deeply moving realization completely, beautifully, and absolutely solidifies the master's unyielding, deeply entrenched position not merely as a brilliant, highly engaging, and entirely fascinating conversationalist, but as an incredibly rare, deeply cherished, highly trusted, and completely indispensable, massive, gravitational fixture in the very, absolute center of the recipient's highly guarded, heavily protected, and incredibly fragile emotional universe. The ultimate realization that the recipient experiences is a profound, paradigm-shifting awakening. They are no longer just interacting with a person, they are interacting with a masterful architect of human emotion. The master communicator has successfully bypassed the brain's logical defenses, creating a fortress of mutual respect and unbreakable rapport. They have proven that every single human interaction, no matter how seemingly brief or entirely trivial, is an incredibly powerful, highly charged opportunity to either build a massive, beautiful psychological cathedral of trust or to lazily, destructively burn a bridge of potential connection. The entire, sweeping philosophy of this conversational mastery hinges entirely on the absolute, total annihilation of the selfish ego, replacing the desperate, toxic need to be constantly perceived as interesting with the profoundly generous, deeply disciplined, and completely unwavering commitment to being endlessly, genuinely interested in the breathtaking, incredibly complex, and deeply fragile emotional reality of absolutely every single human being they encounter. This massive, fundamental psychological shift elevates the master from the crowded, desperate valleys of ordinary, highly forgettable human interaction directly into the absolute, soaring, and deeply exclusive peaks of true, undeniable, and incredibly magnetic social supremacy. The ascent into the highest, most exclusive stratospheres of human society inevitably brings the master communicator face to face with the towering, heavily insulated figures of absolute prestige, the celebrated, the outrageously wealthy, and the globally recognized elite. The amateur, completely blinded by the blinding, intoxicating aura of immense fame or staggering wealth, instantly, pathetically collapses into a highly embarrassing, deeply degrading posture of fawning sycophancy. They gush wildly. They eagerly demand intrusive favors. Or they nervously, frantically attempt to prove their own meager, highly inadequate worth by aggressively, loudly listing their own mundane accomplishments. This highly reactive, incredibly desperate behavior instantly, loudly broadcasts to the VIP that the amateur is a profound, undeniable social inferior, a mere, deeply expendable fan rather than a respected, highly valued peer. The master communicator, possessing an ironclad, unshakable internal fortress of deeply rooted self-worth, completely, entirely rejects this toxic, highly degrading power dynamic. When they encounter the towering, universally recognized figure, they execute the incredibly potent, highly counterintuitive, and profoundly disarming technique of the ego scrub. They do not widen their eyes in feigned, massive shock. They do not desperately, frantically beg for an autograph, a superficial photograph, or a fleeting moment of unearned attention. Instead, they treat the incredibly famous individual with the exact, calm, highly respectful, but entirely unbothered demeanor they would afford an ordinary, highly competent, and deeply respected professional colleague. If they must absolutely mention the VIP's towering achievements, they do so not with the frantic, highly volatile energy of a fanatic, but with the cool, deeply analytical, and highly measured appreciation of a fellow, highly seasoned expert. They casually, smoothly remark on a specific, deeply obscure piece of the VIP's early, uncelebrated work, entirely, brilliantly bypassing the massive, glittering, and highly overexposed accomplishments that the rest of the fawning, deeply predictable world endlessly, exhaustingly praises the profound psychological impact of this masterful, highly disciplined emotional restraint is absolutely staggering. The VIP, deeply exhausted by a long, exhausting lifetime of constant, highly predatory, and heavily transactional adulation, is instantly, miraculously refreshed by the sudden, deeply profound presence of an authentic, completely unbothered equal. The master silently, powerfully communicates that they are fundamentally, entirely unimpressed by the superficial, highly artificial trappings of massive status, and are instead deeply, genuinely interested in the raw, unadorned, and highly complex human being hidden far behind the heavy, glittering curtain of public fame. This establishes an immediate, deeply respected and highly exclusive baseline of absolute, undeniable peerage, instantly elevating the master from a forgettable face in the crowd to an intriguing, highly magnetic enigma that the VIP actively desires to pursue and deeply understand. This profound, deeply entrenched understanding of complex human hierarchies seamlessly, beautifully extends into the cold, highly mechanical, and deeply unforgiving machinery of the massive, sprawling corporate landscape, when the aspiring, highly ambitious professional attempts to aggressively, desperately breach the heavily guarded, deeply fortified inner sanctum of a powerful CEO, a massive investor, or a highly influential decision-maker. They inevitably, immediately collide with the formidable, highly trained, and deeply skeptical gatekeeper, the executive assistant. The foolish, arrogant, and deeply short-sighted amateur treats this incredibly vital, highly powerful individual as a mere, highly annoying, and completely insignificant obstacle. They speak with a cold, highly dismissive, and deeply patronizing tone, aggressively, rudely demanding immediate, unquestioning access to the corporate throne room while utterly, entirely ignoring the profound, undeniable humanity of the person guarding the heavy, wooden door. The master communicator, operating with a vast, highly strategic, and deeply empathetic panoramic vision of complex human ecosystems, intimately, profoundly understands that the gatekeeper is not a mere servant, but the absolute, highly trusted, and deeply influential right hand of the monarch. They deploy the incredibly charming, highly respectful, and profoundly effective technique of the gatekeeper's grace. They address the assistant by their specific, carefully remembered name. They speak with a tone of immense, unyielding respect and warm, deeply genuine camaraderie. They do not arrogantly demand access, they humbly, beautifully request the assistant's highly valued, incredibly specialized guidance in carefully, appropriately navigating the complex, highly sensitive schedule of their powerful superior. By treating the often overlooked, deeply underappreciated gatekeeper with the exact, profound, and highly concentrated reverence typically reserved exclusively for the towering CEO, the master completely, entirely short-circuits the defensive, highly hostile corporate machinery. The gatekeeper, suddenly, beautifully experiencing a massive, rushing tide of deep, unexpected, and entirely genuine professional validation, instantly, miraculously transforms from a cold, unyielding, and highly hostile barrier into a fierce, highly devoted, and incredibly powerful internal advocate. When the master finally, inevitably reaches the ultimate, highly coveted decision-maker, their reputation has already been massively, beautifully enhanced by the glowing, deeply enthusiastic endorsement of the highly trusted gatekeeper, proving definitively that absolute, universal respect is the ultimate, incredibly powerful skeleton key that effortlessly, silently unlocks every single, heavily guarded door in the entire, sprawling labyrinth of human enterprise. As the complex, highly demanding professional and personal relationships inevitably deepen, the master must constantly, expertly navigate the treacherous, deeply impersonal, and highly volatile medium of the modern telephone, a device that ruthlessly, completely strips away the immense, deeply comforting, and highly protective layer of physical body language, leaving only the naked, highly vulnerable, and entirely exposed human voice. The amateur, completely lacking the necessary, highly disciplined vocal awareness, answers the ringing phone with a cold, abrupt, and deeply distracted tone, instantly, violently projecting a massive, heavy aura of profound annoyance and deep, highly stressful inconvenience. The master communicator, deeply, intimately aware of the massive, highly disproportionate emotional weight carried by a single, invisible inflection, utilizes the incredibly powerful, highly charming, and deeply validating technique of the smiling voice. Before they ever entirely pick up the heavy, ringing receiver, they force their physical, heavily stressed facial muscles into a wide, highly expansive, and deeply genuine smile. This seemingly microscopic, highly artificial physical adjustment miraculously, completely alters the physical, anatomical shape of their vocal cords, instantly, beautifully injecting a massive, rushing, and deeply resonant wave of absolute, unadulterated warmth directly into the sterile, electronic signal. When they finally, smoothly answer, they do not immediately, coldly state their name in a flat, deeply uninviting monotone. They pause, waiting carefully for the invisible caller to completely identify themselves, and then, upon recognizing the voice, they unleash a sudden, highly explosive, and incredibly joyful surge of massive, vocal enthusiasm, creating the beautiful, deeply intoxicating, and completely irresistible illusion that the caller's specific, highly individual voice is the exact, absolute, and profoundly joyous sound they had been desperately, eagerly hoping to hear all day. This incredible, highly strategic vocal manipulation instantly, completely bathes the invisible, distant caller in a warm, deeply comforting, and highly validating glow of absolute, undeniable importance, setting a profoundly positive, incredibly receptive emotional baseline for the entire, impending conversation before a single, highly consequential piece of complex, stressful business has even been formally, tentatively discussed. When the inevitable, terrifying, and deeply uncomfortable moments of severe, highly volatile human conflict violently, unexpectedly arise, the master communicator does not defensively, aggressively retreat into the cold, highly impenetrable, and deeply alienating fortress of corporate policy or rigid, highly unyielding technicalities. When faced with a deeply angry, highly frustrated, and incredibly volatile client or a massively disappointed, deeply hurt personal connection, the amateur relies on the absolute, most highly toxic, and deeply infuriating phrase in the entire human language: "It's not my policy," or "I cannot do that." The master, possessing an incredible, deeply vast, and highly empathetic emotional vocabulary, completely, ruthlessly bans these deeply negative, highly destructive words from their entire, massive linguistic arsenal. They deploy the deeply comforting, highly constructive, and profoundly disarming technique of the positive pivot. They never, absolutely never explicitly, directly state what they completely, entirely cannot do. Instead, they seamlessly, beautifully, and instantly pivot the entire, massive momentum of the conversation toward exactly, specifically what they absolutely, eagerly, and highly enthusiastically can do to immediately, powerfully alleviate the deep, agonizing, and highly acute pain of the aggrieved individual. They completely, selflessly absorb the massive, highly toxic shockwave of the other person's raw, unadulterated, and fiercely burning anger without ever, for a single, microscopic moment, reflecting it back in a highly defensive, deeply destructive counterattack, by refusing to engage in a highly destructive, deeply pointless, and incredibly rigid battle over strict, unyielding boundaries, and instead constantly, relentlessly offering highly creative, deeply empathetic, and entirely constructive alternative solutions. The master miraculously, entirely diffuses the massive, ticking, and highly explosive psychological bomb. The furiously angry, deeply wounded individual is suddenly, completely disarmed. Their massive, rushing, and highly volatile adrenaline completely deprived of the expected, highly defensive resistance it desperately, fiercely needs to survive. The incredibly deep, highly philosophical lesson extracted directly from this massive, deeply intense emotional crucible is that human beings do not actually, fundamentally demand perfect, flawless, and entirely magical solutions to every single, highly complex problem. They desperately, agonizingly, and profoundly hunger for absolute, undeniable, and deeply visible proof that their specific, highly acute pain is being fiercely, genuinely, and completely acknowledged by a deeply compassionate, highly resourceful, and entirely unwavering ally, as the vast, incredibly intricate, and deeply profound tapestry of these meticulously crafted, highly specific, and beautifully executed psychological micro-maneuvers is finally, completely woven together into a single, unified, and massively powerful behavioral philosophy. The absolute, undeniable, and deeply transformative truth of the master communicator's existence is beautifully, brilliantly laid bare before the watchful, highly analytical eyes of the world. The stunning, incredibly profound realization is that all of these precise, highly calculated physical gestures, these perfectly, brilliantly engineered conversational pivots, and these deep, highly strategic vocal inflections are not a disconnected, highly manipulative collection of cheap, superficial, and deeply deceitful party tricks. They are, in absolute, fundamental reality, the highly disciplined, perfectly refined, and profoundly beautiful physical manifestations of a single, deeply rooted, and entirely unyielding state of mind, absolute, radical, and completely unconditional empathy. The master communicator has successfully, entirely, and completely transcended the tragic, deeply suffocating, and incredibly paralyzing prison of the fearful, constantly grasping, and highly insecure human ego. They have discovered that the ultimate, absolute, and most terrifyingly effective way to capture the deep, burning, and completely unwavering devotion of the entire, sprawling world is to completely, selflessly, and entirely forget oneself, by treating every single, seemingly mundane interaction as a profound, highly sacred, and deeply charged opportunity to fiercely, brilliantly elevate the deeply fragile, incredibly vulnerable, and highly insecure self-esteem of another human soul. They create a massive, beautiful, and completely irresistible gravitational field of pure, unadulterated, and highly magnetic charisma. They move through the cold, heavily disconnected, and profoundly indifferent modern world not as a desperate, highly needy seeker of validation, but as a massive, towering, and deeply generous benefactor of profound, psychological light, effortlessly, silently, and beautifully unlocking the heaviest, most heavily guarded, and deeply rusted iron doors of human opportunity simply by recognizing, validating, and deeply honoring the profound, undeniable humanity hidden desperately, silently within every single, fleeting glance. The core message and incredibly profound, deeply transformative meaning that this monumental, immensely practical book intends to completely, unequivocally convey to its vast, global audience of highly ambitious readers is that extraordinary, unparalleled social and professional success is absolutely, undeniably not the exclusive, highly guarded province of the genetically gifted, the outrageously wealthy, or the incredibly, naturally eloquent. It teaches, with absolute, terrifying, and perfectly crystal clear clarity, that magnetic, irresistible charm is a highly systematic, deeply learnable, and incredibly precise behavioral science. The book violently, aggressively, and completely dismantles the deeply defeatist, highly toxic myth that you are permanently, genetically trapped by your own inherent, deeply ingrained social awkwardness, proving instead that by deliberately, carefully, and incredibly systematically adopting the precise, microscopic physical habits, the perfectly engineered vocal tones, and the deeply empathetic conversational strategies of the world's most incredibly successful communicators, absolutely any individual can miraculously, permanently, and completely transform their entire, overarching reality. It demands that the reader completely, entirely stop viewing human interaction as a highly stressful, deeply terrifying, and incredibly chaotic obstacle course, and instead embrace it as a profoundly beautiful, highly structured, and entirely masterable art form where the smallest, most deeply nuanced, and seemingly insignificant psychological adjustments consistently, unfailingly yield the most massive, breathtaking, and deeply life-altering rewards imaginable. The ultimate, absolute, and profound meaning is that the key to unlocking the entire, vast, and sprawling world is firmly, permanently rooted in the incredibly disciplined, deeply empathetic, and highly conscious elevation of absolutely everyone else. The ultimate conquest of the human heart is achieved not by proving how fascinating you are, but by undeniably proving how intensely fascinated you are by them.